Okay, good evening,
Evening.
everyone, and welcome to the last day of the year where I will be coming out of one pair of socks with the temperature dropping as it is. So this is a bit of a fill-in, obviously, for the scheduled presentation. It's something I've flung together in the past 48 hours. I honestly have no idea what it's about. The slides are really for my benefit, so it reminds me and gets me through. But this first one is the cover, or part of it at least, of a book I worked on about 3 years ago. It started out as a podcast series, and I wrote it having been involved in spirituality groups for a long time, having also been involved in looking at conspiracy, and seeing the issue of COVID arising and these great disagreements arising in those kind of spaces where half the room would be, let's say, have a very conspiratorial outlook, and the other half would read The Guardian, and the kind of arguments that would set off and the polarization. And so I wrote as, okay, let's take a deeper look at this thing of like conspiracy. What does it mean? What do we mean by that? And I don't mean it in a pejorative way at all. So that's not what I'm talking about this evening particularly, but I am drawing on some themes in the book. Good evening, Ian. We've just started. No, you're fine. We've just started. So I'd like to start out by acknowledging that I certainly feel, maybe some of you will too, that we have it really difficult in some senses, because probably at some point all of us had a very normal outlook on the world. Like, we thought the government was there to do kind of what it said in the tin. Like, we might have thought the health service was inefficient, but basically if you went to it, you got the best treatment. The army was there to defend the national interest, and that being the interest of the people of the country. And the education system, yeah, there may be some nonsense in it, but it got the kids through. And then for probably all of us, there was an incident or a series of incidents that took our minds about that. And we had to wake up one day and acknowledge we just weren't in Kansas anymore. Okay, we got into this upside down Oz world where all the institutions were doing the opposite, where the health service seemed to be there to keep people sick. The education service is now there to make people stupid. And the government, far from being inefficient and a bit crap, was really acting against our interests. And this is a very difficult thing to make sense of. So in the book, I use the tarot card, or the tower, to symbolize this. So the tower representing the knowledge we build up, the ideas we have about society and what it is and everything about the world, how it makes sense. And then out of nowhere, zap, a lightning bolt comes and strikes the tower. And it all comes crumbling down, it burns to the ground. So this zap, for a lot of people, in the book I talked about a man I met who had told me about this completely normie outlook he had until he saw Building 7 collapse, a literal tower, one day, and just sat there shocked looking at it. And that's a controlled demolition. That's a controlled, there's no two ways about it, that's a controlled demolition. And then that undid everything else in his world. For other people, it's the financial crash and looking at the nature of the monetary system. So hang on, what is money exactly? This doesn't make sense at all. And for, I guess, people in this room, some of us at least, it would have been sitting at home during the first lockdown thinking, what the heck is this about? And why is everyone joined a cult? And where was my invitation to it? I didn't get one, but now everyone's doing this crazy thing. So something happens and the thread comes undone abruptly, or maybe a little bit more gradually, but we move into this like very complex information ecology where we go from Trevor McDonald telling us what the world's like in the evening news to suddenly, I don't actually know what this is. I typed in complex conspiratorial information. This is what came up. It's actually something to do with someone losing a cat, but it represents the kind of overwhelming complexity of at one moment you've got experts to guide you, and now all of a sudden there's an assault because they're coming for you too. Someone's going to stick something in your arm and you're being locked in your house and you can't even protest anymore, and then you're going to be able to boil your kettle once a week. So it's a lot. It's a big wave that hits us. And there could be an understandable desire to look at all this complexity and draw a kind of central narrative out of it, to reform that sense of having a coherent worldview that we used to have when we could watch the 10 o'clock news into a new worldview, maybe one based around conspiracy, maybe one based around Davos or the World Economic Forum or the Anglo-American establishment or the Illuminati, or some kind of powerful structure that is at the center of this, doing that. So this image, I just found it, but it represents all this complex information and an image emerging, a pattern emerging of like, oh, it all seems to be coming from the same source. And so what I'm going to go on tonight to say is, it's not really a critique of that, but it's a look at how that can be a very challenging landscape, and how maybe that landscape is also infiltrated to some degree and controlled. And some of you won't agree with some of the positions I'll take. And that's fine. We can talk about it at the end. And also, I'm not putting things up there. Everything I say is, like, this is the absolute true position. It's more to make people think and make people think about how we're thinking about this stuff. Okay. So, who has heard of the term limited hangout? Anyone familiar with that term? No one's familiar with the term?
Yeah. No.
Anthony at the back there, you've heard it. Yeah, okay. So, a limited hangout actually comes from the Nixon era, where he got caught on the Watergate tapes, and he was talking about, it means that if I do something wrong, okay, and I say, no, I didn't do it, that wasn't me, and then I get more and more people accusing me, and suddenly it becomes implausible that I didn't, and then someone says maybe they've got a photo and I'm on video doing it, I might make a little bit of information leak out and make a confession and appear contrite, but not as a way of really owning up to it, as an act of misdirection. To put you off the scent again. So I limitedly hang out some information to digress. So I'll give a couple of examples. One would be in 1964, the National Security Agency, the famous NSA, the ones that are listening to our phone calls right now, they intercepted signals of Vietnamese ships attacking a ship called the USS Vincennes off the coast of Vietnam in a place called the Gulf of Tonkin. Okay, and they relayed this to the White House. And Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time, got up and announced to his fellow Americans that we were now at war with North Vietnam because the American ships had come under this unprovoked attack. None of that was true. The North Vietnamese were not suicidal. They did not attack an American warship. This was fabricated, as many things were, to start the war. So when those files became declassified in 2004, 50 years later, or 2014, 50 years later, some Americans were understandably upset about this after the 58,000 of their countrymen dying and all the horrific injuries. So the information that was leaked out was that, well, what happened? Was that there were junior analysts there who made a mistake. And then, rather than admit it, they started to cover that up by sending more and more signals to the president indicating it was the war and hiding away the ones that indicated that the ships hadn't been attacked. It was all very confusing. There was some kind of stormy weather that night. So yes, the NSA made a mistake and got America into this war, but it wasn't intentional. That's the important thing. So that's a limited hangout. That's a way of acknowledging something and getting the population to go back to sleep. Because the core thing is you don't want to know that your leaders are evil and are directly leading into war. I'll give one further example. This man's name is Frank Olson. He was a scientist for the US Army. And then one night he either jumped or fell, that's what it said in his coroner's report, out of a hotel window. This is back in the 1950s, okay? And that was the story for 20 years, except his family never accepted that he did this, that he was suddenly suicidal. And when CIA documents were declassified in the mid-1970s, it turned out he'd been part of the MKUltra program. He'd been involved with that in his research. And all of a sudden, this story of jumped or fell, we don't know what, wasn't tenable anymore for a lot of different investigative reasons that had been going on. So General Ford, the then president, had to come forward and say, look, the CIA, they tried to cover this up. But what actually happened was, Mr. Olson, he took LSD. We gave him LSD. He didn't even know. Okay, he took it as part of the MKUltra program and got a bad reaction and jumped out of this window. We're very sorry. He has several $1 million of compensation. Let's never do it again. That wasn't true either. And only because his son spent the rest of their lives investigating his case, they later found that wasn't the case either. Actually, he'd seen things in possibly bioweapons in Korea, possibly to do with MKUltra, that had troubled his conscience. And he was talking, and he was whacked over the head and thrown out of the window. And they basically proved that through interviews and exhuming the body and all the rest. So, but most of these things stay covered because mostly the limited hangout works and it diverts attention away and people accept, oh, okay, I see, they got carried away at the LSD and they shouldn't have done that, but it's not like they murdered anyone. And it's kind of easy to believe because, you know, I'm sure you've all got carried away with LSD in your lives, but you probably never murdered anyone. So, you know, it speaks to the expectation that you have that other people are like you and they wouldn't do things that morally you wouldn't do. So that's kind of how it works. So in the book, I explored the concept of an unlimited hangout, which is not really, it's a kind of a name I made up. I consider it exaggerated hangout, but I was trying to describe a phenomenon, which is a kind of a form of a limited hangout, but in an opposite way. So if a limited hangout is holding certain information back, an unlimited hangout would be to put so much information out there, it becomes overwhelming. And information that say you're questioning whether the moon landings happened, okay? So you have people coming along and saying, from NASA, say a NASA whistleblower says the moon is actually, yeah, they didn't happen, and the moon is actually made of cheese, okay? So it makes the whole thing look ridiculous by association. So, and here's where we get into, areas where people are, might find it disagreeable, but I'll go through and then we can talk about it at the end. So the man on the left there is, as you can see the low resolution image, is David Shaler. He was a prominent MI5 whistleblower in the 1990s. He blew the whistle on MI6 actually attempting an assassination plot against Colonel Gaddafi. It went wrong, and a bunch of people in Libya blew up, got murdered in the gunfight that ensued, and ultimately has this connection where it ultimately leads up to the Manchester arena bombing. I won't go into that, but that's a very bad thing MI6 did. Shaler's conscience was troubled and he blew the whistle. After that, he went on a strange journey. Has anyone heard of him, by the way, David Shaler? He went on a kind of strange journey after that. And this is him on Sky News talking about 9/11. Okay, so I've actually had the opportunity to work on a podcast centered around 9/11. And I've been involved in, either directly involved in the interviews of, or sort of backstage on the interviews of multiple people from the FBI and CIA and the alphabet soup agencies. Just so I have this friend who's really into it, and I sort of tag along. And two things I can tell you about 9/11 that you could go into court and prove about it. Okay, is the NSA had the information to stop the attacks, but they didn't run the computer system, and they found that afterwards when someone did. And the CIA knew two of the hijackers had entered the country and blocked that information from going to the FBI. And at least one of them was an extremely highly wanted man because of previous terrorist activity. And the correct procedure would be for the FBI to pick up on it, because they're the internal agency, like MI5. And the CIA blocked that information. And that essentially, I know people have different narratives about this, but that essentially allowed those men to go forward and hijack plane Flight 77, which went into the Pentagon. So if normal procedures had just been followed, that would have stopped the attacks. Now, you could go to court with that information. It's so solid, you could get gross negligence, criminal negligence convictions tomorrow, okay? So that's will be a very productive way of engaging with 9/11 truth, say, and justice. So I've got a few audio clips to play, which I hope is going to work. It's going to go from my Bluetooth thing there. And this is the audio clip of, I don't have the video clips, that's a bit, I didn't get to that, but this is the audio of what was said in the interview.
Foot hole. Now that clearly means that the object has gone through 6 layers of reinforced concrete, each 1.5 feet.
No, I read about this. This is a cruise missile attack, right? I read the conspiracy theories.
So that is evidence consistent with the cruise missile attack.
Which begats any kind of belief, doesn't it, that the Americans was launched a cruise missile from what vehicle?
Well, clearly it had to be fired by the American military again, because it wouldn't have got through the Pentagon's automated anti-missile defense system if it wasn't sending out a friendly fire signal.
There again, a friend of mine, not a friend of a friend of mine, an actual friend of mine, watched the plane crashing into the Pentagon, because his office, his TV production company, is above it, and he watched the entire thing happen.
So I should probably give you a bit more context to that. David Shaler is putting forward the view that a plane didn't hit the Pentagon, and he goes on in the interview to talk about the planes being holograms, the Twin Towers. So just follow the narrative on this. A man leaves MI5, drops some juicy information, which is very worth knowing, but doesn't actually do that much damage to the intelligence agencies, but gives him a lot of credibility, and then enters the alternative arena and does so at quite an extreme end of the spectrum. Doesn't do what you might think he might do, which is use his intelligence angle to talk about the historical relationship between the CIA and Al-Qaeda and more broadly radical Islam, and how they're really one thing, unified. He talks about this quite extreme end, which I mean, I know people will disagree with this, but I can say why that wouldn't hold up in court. I'll just play one more. Okay, so I'm now going to play a clip by an economist, Morgan Reynolds, who worked in the Bush White House, walked out of the Bush White House with a lot of criticisms about the nature of the regime. And this is George W. Bush, the pretend cowboy president, and saying things, very interesting things about how that's what they did. They were just concerned about Bush's image, his re-election. They didn't care about economic policy. And then Reynolds enters, he established certain credibility through doing that. And then he enters the 9/11 debate, he goes on Fox News, and this is what he has to say.
Well, you say, for example, that there were no planes that hit the World Trade Center? Is that your contention?
No, what I say is that there were no big Boeing crashes at all 4 events. There's no significant wreckage, for example.
Well, did you see the videotape that the rest of us saw?
Sure, and I encourage everybody to do a frame-by-frame penetration of the South Tower, and what you will see is a fake, a cartoon display. Because an aluminum plane cannot go through a building like the South Tower was, as if it were thin air.
Reynolds essentially goes on Fox News and talks about how the planes going into the buildings were holograms. Now, I would suggest there was a symbiotic relationship here between Sky News and David Shayler and Fox News and Morgan Reynolds, in that they could have selected anyone to go on. They could have selected any kind of intelligence expert to go on and really bust the 9/11 thing right open. But whatever you think of their case, it's clear to me that Shayler and Reynolds were selected because they would say something outrageous. And Fox News could then use that to say, you see these kind of kooks here, what they're into. And it's very clear that's the selection process to me. So David Shayler then goes on, we'll see if this one works, to have an interesting life. He goes on a path of leaving MI5, doing some decent whistleblowing, talking about conspiracies. He then inserts himself into the 7/7 campaign, and again goes to quite an extreme end of the spectrum. So there's really, with 7/7, the London tube bombings, there are really two kind of truth campaigns that took off. There was one that was very erudite, and then there was one that was like more far out, and the one that was more far out got the media attention. And this is where Shayler ends up.
For years, David Shayler has been a thorn in the flesh of Britain's intelligence establishment. An MI5 officer for 6 years, he went to jail after leaking secret documents to the press. In the last 10 years, he's been a novelist, a writer on security matters and a political activist. But his latest role may be the most talked about yet, that of mystic. Sally Gould went to meet him.
Church bells rang and rang and rang, and I was sitting there feeling slightly uncomfortable. He says, "That's the proclamation of you being the Messiah. You are the Messiah."
Shayler says his conclusions on spirituality are just the next step on what's been a long road of truth-telling. He's now settled in Dartmoor in Devon, where he's been following signs that eventually led him to a psychic that he believes channeled the spirit of Mary Magdalene.
She says, "I've been asked to anoint you with a spikenard." So I'm lying there and I get anointed. She puts the Messianic cross on my forehead. And it ends. And she said to me, and I said to her, "Do you know what you've just done?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "It's a new era." And she said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Don't you realise you've just anointed the Messiah?" And she said, "No, I haven't." And I said, "Well, that's what the Magdalene was indicating to me, and that's what you've just done."
So I don't know if it strikes anyone as strange. David Shayler leaves MI5, whistleblows, short time in jail, hands out some juicy information, but is not, as the interviewer says, exactly a thorn in the side of the intelligence agencies. It's not like they had their budgets cut back. It's not like anyone in them went to jail or they had any more parliamentary oversight because of this. So he's not really that destructive to him. He then inserts himself and starts propagating conspiracy, and then becomes a messiah figure, and ultimately ends up transitioning to become a woman. Now, I know a podcaster who did a series on David Shayler and this whole kind of thing around 7/7 and the what he saw as the attempt to derail the 7/7 truth movement. His name's Tom Secker. He wrote, I think, one of the best books on 7/7 truth. And he was convinced that Shayler never left MI5, and this was all just an agent provocateur kind of thing. And we do know, of course, that such things happen, right? Like undercover police officers having long-term sexual relationships with activists whilst also being married under false identities. And these are not people who pose any great threat to the security establishment or the national interest. They're green activists. They're, protesting outside McDonald's or something. But that was worthy of committing this major resource of police time, people spending their lives undercover for years, and this just incredible ethical violation of basically raping these women. So they do that for basically no reason, okay? So one would have to assume that groups, whether it's here or certainly in the UK, have a certain level of infiltration. It's certainly happened to campaign against the arms trade. I actually went to a talk on 7/7 Truth in the UK once in London about 14 years ago, and there were openly inspectors from the Metropolitan Police Force in the pub with us afterwards, acknowledging their role. And one of them, I was talking to him, and he said, "Oh, you could drive a bus through the case of 7/7. He's quite open about admitting that. So it seemed like, he's a police officer, he's genuinely interested in this. And then he finished his pint and said, "Oh, but it's all going to kick off on Thursday. Barack Obama has taken the day off, and David Cameron, and they've called in the security cabinet, and everything is going to kick off. Watch out for Thursday." That was a complete nonsense statement, right? So I just wondered, is he a police officer who's getting involved in conspiracy theories on the internet and getting carried away? Or is that his job there, to go in and just seed bad information whilst having that kind of cover and keeping an eye on things? So you would expect to see that, because you also see, we don't know to what extent it goes on, but some level of infiltration of the online space. And by, like, lots of people do this, Amazon do this, and Monsanto have done it, Israel do loads of it, China. So, but just infiltrating online spaces to put forth a narrative and to control the agenda. So I think it's maybe reasonable to think the state is infiltrating these spaces in some way and creating narratives that derail truth movements. I don't think it's the only reason that people do this. I think that that straight up narcissism can be a reason to assert yourself in a space where you appear to be very caring about people and you appear to be a fighter for justice, but there are other psychological drives going on beneath the surface. And there can also be financial motivations. So I'm going to read, because I run a podcast, I get contacted by people who want to come on. And I one time received an email from a guy who told me that he got looking into all this stuff from the central banks. He wanted to know how money worked, and he'd become convinced it was all scam. Fine, I think it is. But then he'd gone from there to the flat earth. And he hadn't landed on the flat earth, he kept falling to the point where he felt that all celebrities in the popular space were transgender. They'd all had sex reassignment surgery. And I thought, that's strange. Wouldn't people have noticed that at some point? No. Because they were grown in vats. They weren't actually born in normal ways. They were grown in underground CIA bases in vats in laboratories. So this is pretty extreme as conspiracies go. I said yes to the interview, of course. Well, I said yes, actually, because he described how he'd had a family breakdown because of this. His wife had divorced him, and his children no longer spoke to him because he got into this extreme kind of stuff. So I think that's interesting. So I spent a few days like learning about flat Earth and light diffraction and why you can see Chicago from a lake that's so too far away for it to be seen from. And okay, that's all very good. And then I found out that there was this massive financial aspect to what he did, where he was promising people that he could get them, this is mostly Americans, right, but promised people that he could get them sorted out with a passport and certain things that you would say to police officers that pull you over on the side of the road for a speeding offence or anything else that would essentially get you off the charge, and they would have to go, yes, sir, and let you go, as if this is something that all police officers learn in at a training school, right? So I looked at this and I found comparisons of the people, and I wrote him a Dear John letter because his name was John. I'm just going to read a bit of the email I wrote. It said, "Hello, John. I've read your book and found your story very interesting. I'm happy to do an interview, but I think I should let you know where I'm at first. I disagree with the overwhelming majority of your claims concerning flat Earth, trans celebrities, and the Mandela effect. He also thought the devil had gone back in time and rewritten the Bible, so that was another aspect. I have watched your presentations. I am unsure of what to make of the state-national aspect of your work. I do not believe it is possible to acquire a passport that instructs police officers to neither detain nor question you. If you decide to come on, I will have to ask you about the thousands of dollars of suggested donations for your services. It would be inexcusably remiss of me not to do so. When I do, I can absolutely guarantee that practically 100% of my listeners will assume that you are running a scam, similar to the one Sovereign Citizen is accused of running. You are, of course, welcome to respond in any way you wish, but I have to make you aware this will be the case. Due to the extreme nature of your claims and the amount of money involved, I am left questioning whether you really believe the things you present or not. I would have to be honest about that in the interview. If you're happy with these conditions, I shall arrange a time." And he just replied back to me, said, "Hi, Richard, thanks for the heads up, I'll pass." Which I took as basically the acknowledgement that it was a scam, and he thought I'd give him a nice sort of heads up, mate, because you're not going to be able to advertise it here. And he went off. I got another email from him 6 months later telling me he's very interested in my podcast because he'd forgotten. So I think they can just be straight up financial reasons. So people are either in league with the state, they have personalities, or they're not acting for good motivations necessarily. Okay. So this is Mr. Ike with on Newsweek with Andrew Neil. That's it. Andrew Neil. No, what was it? So let's have a listen to this one.
The thing is, this is the point. The mainstream media has accepted that those same characters lied about Iraq, but will not question in any way the same people's version of 9/11. They're journalists. It's their job.
But do you still think the royal family were shape-shifting lizards?
Yes, I do.
You do?
Yes.
Okay, so my point here is similar, that I don't know if people shapeshift or not. I've seen some funky stuff in my time, so maybe they do, okay? But why is David Icke invited on this week to discuss this? Well, I would suggest he's not invited on for his opinions on 9/11, and neither of you is invited on for his opinions on shapeshifting Queen Mothers. But it's the symbiosis of those things. It's the connection, because he can associate one with the other. And irrespective of whether people do shapeshift or not, the reason they want him on the BBC is so he can put those things together, and it makes conspiracy claims look stupid, okay? Irrespective of whether you agree with them or not, okay? So, who's heard of the term mythops?
Yeah.
No, you've heard of it.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Psyops.
No, not science, mythops.
I have heard of it.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought I made it up yesterday. might be something else.
I've heard.
Well, I thought I made it up yesterday, so I was going to like, it was a joke.
I have heard of
Okay, well maybe it's a
I've heard
thing.
That being said, I have heard. I'm not sure of the definition of it, but I've
Go on.
heard
Is
it.
it like a fabrication of a culture's myth to propagate control?
Yes, it is, right? So it's like a psychological operation. And again, it actually seems to be that there's a real thing called mythops, which
There
I'm
is, yeah.
not talking about. So what I made up yesterday, and didn't bother to check whether anyone else had, was
Your subconscious mind.
was that idea of
Somewhere.
a psychological operation that is that plays on culture's themes, mythologies, fairy tales to control the population. So, as an example, I'll read this out. So, what you've got is the father and son there, and the father has this contraption of a whacking device on the back of a door that he can set off a bell, and he says, "Oh, Danny, sounds like the monster in the basement has heard you crying again. Let's be real quiet and hope he goes away." So this is a Larson Far Side comic, right? Pretty famous one. You probably had it pop up on your Facebook. And so what you have here is the father playing on the child's mythological belief in monsters in the basement in order to assert control over him. So if you now replace the father with the state and the child with the populace and mythology, the kind of things we believe, that's how a mythop would work. This is Colonel Edward Langsdale, okay? So let's just take a trip to the Philippines. Bit of background, the United States invaded and conquered the Philippines in the very early years of the 20th century and ran it as a colony, extracted resources. They then had it taken off them by the Japanese in the Second World War. In combination with the Philippines, actually most of the Filipinos that did it, booted the Japanese out. The United States came back in and wanted to retake their colony then. And the Filipinos had developed a resistance movement against Japanese, and that carried on, saying they didn't really want the Americans back taking their resources either. So brutal insurgency war ensued. Colonel Langsdale had a background in advertising, in a bit of the Edwin Bernays tradition of how to manipulate public perception. And he studied the mythology and the folklore of the Filipino people. And he would do things like, if he found a village that was supporting the rebels, he would wait till there was really low clouds.
Yeah, it's vampires, isn't it?
Yeah, you've just given away the surprise, but yeah.
Sorry.
So we're going. That's next, right? So the first thing he did was the planes over the low cloud, and they would blare out messages to the villagers through a megaphone that sounded like they were curses from the spirit world, telling them not to support the rebels. Okay, so that put them off. And do you know what the other thing he did was? Everyone looked surprised. Vampires. The CIA formed an alliance with vampires. Okay, so what they did was they apparently the Philippines had this belief in vampires. So when the Hooks were out patrolling for the frost, I'm sorry, this is rather gruesome. That the Marines would come up and snatch him out of the back and kill him, and then they would hang him upside down and punch 2 holes in his neck and leave him to drain out. Sorry, this is very disgusting, right? And they believed, Langsdale reported this was very effective because the Hawk fighters were terrified of vampires, and they would flee the area so they could move them around and control them through mythology. Now, did it really work, or was Langsdale telling tall stories? The Filipinos might have fled because they were scared of US Marines doing this to them as opposed to vampires. We don't really know. It got repeated in Vietnam, but it was certainly an area of investigation. We're not really afraid of vampires in our culture, but we are. Our thing is like coming from Christianity, Satanism and witchcraft. Okay, and you can see this for hundreds of years. Thousands of people have been burned, and these things carry on in some ways, like satanic panic in the US. So that's our kind of our equivalent, our folklore, if you wanted to manipulate us. So is there any evidence like that the intelligence services have used our mythological beliefs to control us in witchcraft? Well, yes, there is actually. There actually is. So I'm going to play a clip for a documentary about a fellow called Colin Wallace, who was an intelligence officer in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. And he would do a lot of tricks in the media, okay? So women were carrying bombs around for the paramilitaries, and they wanted to discourage that. So they would plant a story about a woman who had put bomb parts in her knickers, it reacted into the nylon, and she'd had a horrible explosion, was now maimed for life. It wasn't true, but they put it in the media to discourage that. And that was his job, okay? And then you go to this weird period where British military intelligence start faking satanic rituals in the north of Ireland. So the first voice you hear in this clip is a journalist, and the second voice is that of Colin Wallace, the intelligence officer.
On the 5th of August 1973, an article in the Belfast Sunday News reported that sheep had been sacrificed in a black magic ritual on Copeland Island Beach, northeast of Belfast.
It was a front-page headline in the Sunday News, which lots of people read. The story was that sheep had been ritually killed and mutilated. That was the story, and that it was Satanists who had done this. As a would-be anthropologist and undergraduate at the time, it tweaked my interests, and I began to pay attention as other news stories appeared in other local papers. The more I looked, the more I found, and I began to be really surprised at the degree to which this had been a local newspaper story in Northern Ireland.
From August 1973, stories of witchcraft and black magic began to surface in many local newspapers.
First thing that I had to do was try and understand what witchcraft would look like, and we had no idea. So I bought a book on the subject. Then the whole idea of the sacrifice of animals or whatever it might have been, we got blood from the cookhouse, from the army cookhouse, and we would scatter that over the makeshift altars that were there. Some of that material then we left, and it would be discovered by local people, and then eventually they would talk about it at the press. And gradually the story built up and built up over a period of months. This was a way of really getting the interest of the press, getting rumours going around, and therefore doing the things that we really wanted to happen.
The ritual sites were often located in old graveyards and abandoned properties.
You have to remember that this was a time in Northern Ireland when all kinds of unusual things were happening. Assassinations were a very regular thing, and some of them were particularly bloody and brutal. Torture, mutilation, using knives and blades and things like that. People were talking about ritual murders and all kinds of things. So all of a sudden, all of the moral certainties no longer seem to be quite just as certain.
Information policy sent fake readers' letters to the local press to help fan the rumours.
Quite often, on different subjects, we would write to local newspapers drawing attention to something or criticising something, and then the newspaper would publish that. And it would usually be about a local issue, and it was very much done at local level. But then we would pick up the publication of those letters, and we would then circulate those letters more to the national press to reflect what would be portrayed as local views. Don't forget that we're not just influencing the press. The press is only one way of influencing the public. We had to be able to influence all sorts of other people who were, communicating with the public. And the churches then, in the 70s, had much more influence, of course, than they have today. And therefore, this involvement of witchcraft was quite important. The key thing we wanted the clergy to do, I think, was just to try and go back to reject all types of violence and questionable behavior, and whether that was drugs or witchcraft or terrorism, it was to say that these activities really have no place in the society that we were trying to create. And because at that stage people's world was dominated by the fear of terrorism, we were directly linking a lot of these things together. It was important to look at evil, bad and terrorism all within one package.
So Wallace goes on to describe how this got out of hand, because there was a child murdered and no one knew who had done it, and it was something to do with what they were doing, but then the press started to attribute that to witchcraft, and the whole thing blew up, and they should close the programme down, but it took on a life of its own and continued in the media for about a year after that, this belief in witchcraft. So essentially what they were trying to do was, because it's like Northern Ireland's a more religious society back in the 70s, they were trying to tie the rise in bloodshed and the Troubles to the occult, to black magic, to witchcraft. And say there's some satanic thing behind it all, in the idea that this is then go through the churches and in the media, and people would start to disavow the paramilitaries. So there you have the British state creating a witchcraft scare, using it to manipulate the minds of the populace. No, that's not meant to be there. So I do have to wonder that. I did a podcast series called Reading David Icke, where I read David. I didn't read them on the microphone, but I read his work through the 1990s and looked at the evolution of his thought. I was fascinated to know how a goalkeeper turned sports presenter gets into environmentalism, fair enough, I can understand that, then gets into spiritualism, and a lot of people get into spiritualism, and then gets into conspiracy, and even more extreme conspiracy, and ends up believing that shape-shifting reptiles run the world. So what journey do you have to make to go down there? And these people he met in the mid to late 90s who told him about shape-shifting reptilians. And I just speculate about, maybe they told him that because they all did, or I don't think he made it up, right? I don't think that's he fabricated these encounters. So maybe he was fed information on it. That would be another. It's not implausible that this was some sort of operation, and particularly with the reliance he has on recovered memory. So this is an interesting thing that came up for me in looking at conspiracy culture, was that there's a large chunk of it which comes from the kind of Kathy O'Brien Transformation of America testimonies about being involved in MKUltra, not remembering being involved, and then recovering memories of abuse by George Bush or Bill Clinton or something years later. So I did a big investigation of memory and how that works. So I won't say too much about it, but what I did find was that there was a program around memory that I would not be at all surprised if it was connected to MKUltra, but it involved getting people to believe things that didn't happen and seeing what the most ridiculous thing you could put into someone's mind is and draw out. Now, I hope the volume works. I'll just play a short clip of a documentary that I featured in my wider podcast on that.
Dr. Bennett Brown founded the Dissociative Disorders Unit 1 year ago as part of Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center. Meet Pat.
I'm 32. I'm married. I have 2 children.
By outward appearances, she is normal, but inside are dozens of different people. Where would Pat be without this unit?
I wouldn't be alive. Chances are my children and husband wouldn't be alive either.
Pat Burgess was one of the first patients on the unit in 1986. She arrived after having been in a depression for 3 years, following the difficult birth of her second son. When a social worker diagnosed her with MPD, she sought help at Rush.
These were the experts. They were in a very well-respected teaching institution. I turned to that teaching institution for state-of-the-art medical care, cutting-edge medical care. I didn't turn to them for fringe therapy, some goofy, controversial crap.
What do you hear her say?
That the hurting is over. Dr. Braun often treated me like his star patient. I would have to teach other residents and doctors and media people about multiple personality disorder.
Who's there?
Sarah.
How old are you, Sarah?
I'm 5. I was supposed to switch personalities for the camera.
Who's this?
Karen.
Karen, you don't seem too happy.
I'm not. Dr. Braun and I kind of rehearsed that a few times to make sure that it looked believable for the interviewer. I was supposed to talk about how if it wasn't for Dr. Braun, I wouldn't be alive.
Where would Pat be without this unit?
I wouldn't be alive.
Patty says that Dr. Braun both pushed her to remember things that didn't occur and then believed her stories. After a year in the hospital, Patty traced the satanic history of her family back to the 17th century.
Satanic cult practices have been passed down through the paternal side of the family. Dr. Braun asked me to write up something to do a presentation at his conference. It was supposed to be one of my alter personalities, giving a history about the cult. The satanic activity has been genealogically traced to a southern Slavic region of Europe during the Medieval Ages, when her forebears were the supreme monarchs of the blood royal. I believed that I was a satanic high priestess, that I was controlling a satanic cult in a 9-state region. Revealed was the history of I took it deadly serious. Satanic worship, torturous human sacrifice, cannibalism, and brainwashing. All reality and fantasy just blended together. Before hospitalization, I was drugged, I was hypnotized, and I was mentally ill. She also knew nothing of the But I was told that, until I hit bottom, until I dug all of this stuff out, I would never get better, and I would never have a chance for any kind of a future for my children.
Okay, again, so I hope you could hear that. So essentially the lady was being described, multiple personality disorder, going into this psychiatric unit, and then doctors, when this was prevalent in the 1980s, drawing those personalities out and drawing out personalities of being a witch and a high priestess of connections back to Eastern Europe. And the lady herself ought to be concluded that this was a kind of role play thing that she'd engaged in, but had come to believe it herself for a while. So I think there probably is a connection, and that these kind of doctors were receiving funding from MKUltra as a program to see how the human mind could be messed with in that sense. And it has this kind of, I'm not telling people what to think about this, but it's something that has to be maybe taken into account when listening to accounts of, and if it's anything to do with regression therapy, with alien abductions, or the MKUltra program. It's a very real program, but in terms of what didn't go on within it and what exactly it was. I'll just give one more example of things, okay? I've missed my slide. So there was meant to be a slide, I seem to have misplaced a slide, but there was meant to be a slide of the communist octopus here, ensnaring the world, okay? So on the theme of conspiracy theory not being something that is necessarily antithetical to the state, but something that the state, the empire, the power structures, the archons, whatever they are, can actually use to prop itself up, to rebuild the tower, if you like, or to get its agenda through. You kind of have an example of this where throughout the Cold War, the Central Intelligence Agency pushed a narrative of massive levels of communist infiltration into countries around the world, particularly in South America, and into even the US State Department. And they did this, and they presented this in terms, they would feed information into right-wing publications like the John Birch Society to get the more right-wing of America on board with an interventionist position, with the idea that we should be going out and intervening in all these countries, because the political right were naturally kind of isolationist, didn't want to go out and have foreign crusades. So that needed to be turned around to support the empire. And of course, there was efforts by Stalinist Russia to engage in countries all over the world, but nothing like on the scale as what was being proposed by the CIA. The reason they did that, of course, was that they wanted to control the resources of countries for the benefit of American corporations. And any left-leaning slightly or president or prime minister that comes along in these countries, anyone that talks about land reform, about taking it back from the oligarchs, that had to be squashed. So they used the conspiracy theory of a globalist government, a globalist communist government, in order to, in a sense, build a real global government, not one that encompassed the whole world. There were areas they couldn't get, but one that was engaged in, throughout the Cold War, a total of 70 interventions. 70 interventions to overthrow countries, governments, and install US puppets. So they did kind of build a world government in that area, which goes on to this day. So Anthony Sutton he's a famous guy in conspiracy literature, Anthony Sutton, who wrote about a lot of things, the Bolshevik Revolution being secretly funded by the United States to bring about a communist bloc and create this polarized world order and ultimately lead to a world communist state. And I did like hours of podcasting on Sutton, and his work is so formative to the view taken by David Icke and even people who are quite erudite like James Corbett in his documentaries on it. But I found Sutton's work to be just completely flawed. And you'd have to listen to the podcast if you want to know more about that. But it was interesting just to see that this narrative has been sold, and Sutton would go out and sell this narrative of mass communist infiltration to the world as a way of mobilizing, as a way. One of the interesting talks he does, he's talking to a bunch of like hippie peaceniks, okay, and he's convincing them of the need to build up America's nuclear stockpile to fight off the Soviet Empire. Right. So how do you sell nuclear weapons to hippie peaceniks? Well, you talk about a grand conspiracy of spiritual connotations and all the rest. So again, I'm not telling anyone what to think because I don't know what to think about all of this. It's a very mysterious and difficult landscape and a difficult terrain. But what I am emphasizing is that all the glitters isn't gold, and conspiracy itself in all its forms can be used to prop up imperial structures. So I just had a couple of positive things to end on in terms of what we can do. So I just read this book recently. It was on my mind. So I'm reading the Scout Mindset. Okay, and what Julia Galef, the author, is contrasting is she's saying it's a problem for activist movements that we have all these things we need to fight. We're not just learning about something, which might be interesting. How does the world work? We're also fighting because they're trying to jab stuff in our arm and they're trying to lock us in our homes and they're trying to make it we can boil our kettle once a week and we're not even allowed to protest about this anymore. So there's a lot of pressure, and if you want to fight something, you've got to have like your beliefs kind of set and in concrete to do that, to feel strong enough to go out and combat these people. And Galef says that's actually an illusion. And she has these two different types of competence, what she calls epistemic competence, which just means the confidence in what you know, the confidence in how much do you know about global warming, how much do you know about the vaccine, and also social competence, which I think you could really call authenticity, which is a different kind of communication. It's communication of like, rather than trying to overwhelm someone of knowledge in an argument, being very authentic about, well, why does the vaccine worry you, and what do you think the implications are of global warming, and what's caught of the global warming agenda, rather, what's caught your attention about this, and a movement towards, her case is that effective communicators move more towards authenticity and expression and have a certain humility in what they claim about the world. Because to me, people who are very confident in their positions and claim to know vast amounts about everything, I tend to assume they're delusional, because that's my common experience. People don't have the sense to know what they don't know. So I find this kind of what's being called social competence, this kind of authenticity, much more compelling, and I experience it as being a much more effective way to communicate. So to me, that's, if anything, it's a kind of solution or a silver lining in this, that there is a way kind of to navigate through this complexity where we can keep looking at it, keep trying to understand the world better, but are not entirely reliant on having this pristine, massive understanding of all issues in order to be effective communicators. Thank you.